Mexico elected a new president. What is the prospect of a NAFTA renegotiation?
I'm a little skeptical about whether they're going to be able to get this done in the next 3 or 4 or 5 months before our midterm elections here in Washington. And then if the Democrats take over Congress, they will be more skeptical of giving Trump a victory on anything.
What are the facts about family separations at the border that people don't hear about?
You know, it turns out to be such an exaggerated issue, it's almost fake news. For example, there are some 12,000 minors that are involved right now recently in smuggling into the United States. Of the 12,000, 10,000 have no parents at all.
Will Mexico and America be able to work on border security issues together?
Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Simone. Last week, Mexico elected a new president. Leftist Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who campaigned on ending corruption and economic inequality, ended the century-long dominance by the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Much like the 2016 presidential election in the U.S., Mr. Obrador's win brought a political earthquake to his country. He not only pledged a war against the mafia of powers that has controlled Mexico for decades, but also stood up for Mexico in relations with its northern neighbor. So, how will the future of US-Mexico relations work with two populist presidents who are on opposite sides of the aisle? In this episode, we'll analyze the three biggest issues in US-Mexico relations: immigration, border security, and trade.
Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO among supporters, won over 53% of nationwide votes in Mexico's presidential election last week. His closest competitor won just 20%. The landslide win shows how frustrated Mexican voters are with the corruption and violence that has plagued the country for years. Obrador campaigned on the promise to oust what he called Mexico's mafia of power, referring to the Governing Institutional Revolution Party, or PRI. The PRI dominated Mexican politics for most of the 20th century. Obrador is just the second left-leaning candidate elected in recent history. President-elect Obrador is from southern Mexico, which is poor compared to the rest of the country. Supporters feel he represents the interests of the poor and others who felt ignored by previous leaders. But how will his election affect the future of U.S.-Mexico relations? Can two populist, nationalist presidents compromise? President Trump called to congratulate Obrador and predicts they'll have a good relationship.
Great honor. And I will say that I just spoke with the president-elect of Mexico. We had a great conversation, about a half an hour long. We talked about border security. We talked about trade. We talked about NAFTA. We talked about a separate deal, just Mexico and the United States. We had a lot of good conversation. I think the relationship would be a very good one. We'll see what happens.
Obrador called for better relations with the U.S.
Con el gobierno de Estados Unidos buscaremos una relación de amistad y de cooperación para el desarrollo, siempre fincada en el respeto mutuo y en la defensa de nuestros paisanos migrantes que viven y trabajan honradamente en ese país.
One major issue both Mexico and the U.S. will have to work together on is border security. The Trump administration announced its zero-tolerance approach to illegal immigration in May, which mandated criminal prosecution for each immigrant who enters illegally. An unintended consequence of the policy is that children were separated from their parents while they awaited prosecution. The U.S. mainstream media has been making a focused effort on reporting this issue. On June 20th, after weeks of protest, President Trump signed an executive order to keep families together. Most migrants entering the U.S. illegally are from Central America. In a July 3rd event at the Hudson Institute, Mexican Ambassador Jerónimo Guterres Fernández said the responsibility is on Central American countries and Mexico, not the U.S.
You need to address the root causes of migration, and that's not easy. We must do everything we can, Mexico, Central America, to make sure that immigration is not a forced decision, as it has happened in the vast majority of the cases. That's not the responsibility on the United States. That's on us, I think. We certainly welcome the support of the United States in that regard, and the measures that have been taken over the years to address prosperity and security in the region are welcome. I just think we should do enough. We have not done enough. I think it's appropriate to recognize that.
Ambassador Guterres Fernandez says there are 3 important things they need to do to curb illegal immigration.
Work together to do everything we can so people are not forced out of their countries because of lack of opportunity or any other reason. The second thing is that we should think carefully about, there will continue to be movement of people, because that's just a fact of, the century that we're living in. I think everybody wants for that movement to occur in a way that it's legal, safe, and orderly. Do we have sufficient avenues for that? Are we working enough among the countries and within the countries to make sure that that is happening? And then finally, we need to address very head-on human smuggling and trafficking, which is terrible. And it's happening.
For a U.S. perspective, I talked to Sean Steele, Republican National Committee man, the founder and CEO of Sean Steele Law Firm. He is based out of California. How would you comment on President Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy combined with the executive order of ending family separation? Is it the right balance?
It's an attempt to fix a very broken system. American immigration is the most generous in the world. We happily accept over 1 million legal immigrants a year. We happily accept 500,000 students a year, and then many hundreds of thousands of long-term visa holders. No country, all the countries in the world combined do not equal how generous the United States is. However, we have too many people at the southern border taking advantage, coming to the country without permission, without paperwork, that are upsetting our immigration system. So Trump is trying to fix it. Obama made it much, much worse. Most presidents have ignored it. Congress doesn't do much about it. So Trump is trying to take something decisive and bold to discourage people from coming here without permission, without trying to go through the paperwork. For example, Simone, I'll mention that there's several million Asians that have applied legally, that are waiting their turn. In my family's case, we had to wait for some family members 10 years to get to America. That's the right way to do it. People that are kind of getting to the border, cheating, jumping in line, not only is it unfair, it's immoral and illegal.
Right. Family separation is a big topic right now. Obviously, we don't want children to be separated from their parents. However, how does this situation compare to, say, when an American single parent commits a crime and needs to be sent to jail and be separated from his or her child?
It turns out to be such an exaggerated issue, it's almost fake news. For example, there are some 12,000 minors that are involved right now recently in smuggling into the United States. Of the 12,000, 10,000 have no parents at all. Some of them are as young as 6 years old, and they're pushed across the border by some coyote, by some smuggler, smuggler. What we're discovering is an atrocious human rights problem created in some cases by the parents. Parents or relatives of the children are bringing their kids, they're smuggling their kids through dangerous territory. It's dangerous for the kids. For example, young women, young girls that are smuggled from Guatemala to Mexico, 80% of them get molested by somebody in the 1,500-mile journey. So the people that are encouraging children to come, the parents that bring them, are doing a terrible, wrongful act against their own children. But remember, 85% of the children don't have parents from either side, so there's no separation. And yet, because we're a generous country, unlike every country in Asia, for example, the Japanese would never tolerate this, the Koreans would never tolerate it. Whenever you have illegal people coming, they are promptly taken, arrested, and removed. In America, we feed them, we house them, we give them schools, we go through a long legal process, then they're deported. It's gone too far, and most Americans are upset.
Yeah. But even for those 15% who are separated from their families, how does their situation compare to, for instance, an American citizen who got separated from his children because he committed crime?
We have hundreds of thousands of people that are in jail with their children, not going to jail with their parents, nor should they. You have somebody that's in jail, they're usually unfit to take care of children anyhow. Sometimes you'll have a woman who's convicted of a crime who's pregnant, and as soon as she has the delivery, the baby is removed from her in jail and sent to a foster home. Usually the foster home is not ideal, but it's a lot better than a criminal parent. Same thing applies when you have parents that are going across the border, they're committing a criminal act, they're putting their children in great danger, they know it's great danger, they should be promptly returned to their country with their children, promptly. The trouble is we have too many lawyers that go to court, that delay, and that actually isn't good for the children either.
Some people are saying the timing and the mass media's reporting of this issue reveals political motives. For example, it's related to the midterm elections. Do you agree?
Of course, let's understand that the LA Times, the Columbia University School of Journalism, many organizations have done detailed survey of what is a journalist, what is a reporter. Well over 90% are Democrats, are to the left of Democrats. It's a hostile organization. Most of mainstream media in the world, coming out of China, coming in the United States, is left-wing and doesn't report truth. It reports the journalist ideas. So it's basically a form of propaganda. And guess what? Most Americans know that. The majority of Americans nowadays do not trust American journalists. That's why you're seeing newspapers collapse. That's why you're seeing most of the mainstream media not getting good ratings. In some cases, a used car salesman will have more credibility than an LA Times reporter.
Coming up, how can the U.S. and Mexico improve border security? Another major issue for the U.S. and Mexico is border security, which protects against the illegal movement of drugs, weapons, contraband, and people. One strategy is the border wall, which goes back to 1996 when Congress first mandated its construction as part of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. In 2006, Congress passed the Secure Fence Act, which required fencing along 700 miles of the southwest border. That was never completed. The wall was a major part of President Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. In January 2017, the president signed an executive order to begin construction. Despite criticism that border walls aren't effective, Elizabeth Vallée from Quebec University found 65 countries that have already completed or are building border walls. Whether or not border walls are effective, the root causes of these problems still need to be addressed. Most of the violence caused by drug cartels is rooted in both sides of the border. Demand for drugs in the U.S. and poverty in Mexico as well as Central and South America. Young people who can't get jobs and aren't educated often have no choice but to join drug cartels. On July 4th, Mexican President-elect Obrador promised $7.5 billion for youth job training and aid for the elderly. It could also help the U.S. curb border violence. Mexican Ambassador Geronimo Guterres Fernandez says the U.S. and Mexico can't stop the drugs and violence by just going after cartel leaders.
We need to focus more on disrupting the business model than simply going after the heads of the cartels. If you look at the number, when President Peña Nieto administration started, there were around 100, please don't quote me on the exact numbers, but there were 122 identified main targets. I think 108 of them, or a little bit more, are either behind bars or are now dead. According to that metric, there's been a rather first success on that, and yet that does not seem to be the case. What we need to do is disrupt the business model, because if you don't disrupt the business model and you have a market, as we do, and we don't consider the supply and demand of whether it's drugs, weapons, money, etc., we're not going to be successful.
As the ambassador stated, Mexico's current president has made a lot of progress in taking cartel leaders off the streets, yet it hasn't made much of a difference. Last week's elections were the bloodiest in history, according to a Mexico City-based consulting firm called Attilact. They estimated over 100 people were killed in connection with the elections. Inevitably, violence in Mexico will spill over into the United States. So, how do we deal with border security? And are we doing enough? Here's Sean Steele again. One major issue for the U.S.-Mexico border is violence and trafficking of drugs, weapons, and people. So do you think the Trump administration is putting enough effort in disrupting the business model, the supply and demand, instead of just targeting the heads of the criminal groups?
Well, I think that the entire approach of our foreign policy of border security is radically changing. It doesn't change overnight, but it takes a process. You have to get good leaders, good managers, good people. The Border Patrol has been laughed at for years by the Democrat left. Now, of course, the Democrat left is attacking ICE, our internal security for immigration, and they've taken a very radical proposition that they're calling for ICE to be abolished. Most Americans are offended with that, but there's an absolute new attitude among the American border and foreign policy in general. And you're seeing a lot more respect for America than there has been in the past. And you're seeing more active prosecutions against lawbreakers, particularly those that are running guns, drugs, and people through the border.
Coming up, how will the U.S.-Mexico trade war and NAFTA renegotiations look under AMLO and Trump? The third major issue between the U.S. and Mexico is trade. In May, President Trump ended exceptions to the steel and aluminum tariffs for Mexico and other U.S. allies. In response, Mexico retaliated with its own tariffs on nearly $3 billion worth of U.S. goods, including pork, steel, cheese, bourbon, apples, and other goods. Last Thursday, Mexico imposed its second set of tariffs, which are mostly on U.S. agricultural goods. Mexican tariffs will remain in place as long as the U.S. maintains tariffs on Mexican steel and aluminum. There's also the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. have been trying since August 2017 to renegotiate the trilateral agreement. President Trump has threatened in the past to pull the U.S. out of it altogether if a better deal can't be negotiated. Ambassador Geronimo Guterres Fernandez says the biggest NAFTA negotiation gaps between the U.S. and Mexico are the trade deficit, auto sector, and labor and environmental standards.
I asked Stephen Moore, the Distinguished Visiting Fellow for the Project for Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation, what he thinks about NAFTA and U.S.-Mexico trade negotiations. President Trump recently said he was not happy with the NAFTA negotiations and would not sign a new deal before the midterm elections. Do you think that's a good move?
I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA. I think NAFTA has been good for the whole continent, and I would like to see this. It needs to be modernized because it's some 20 or so years old. But it would be smart, I think, for Donald Trump to negotiate a new agreement with Canada and Mexico, because those are two of our most important allies, and I think it would be good for the economies of the entire continent as we compete against Asia and Europe in the years and decades ahead.
Critics have been saying President Trump should bring America's allies, such as Canada, Mexico, and the EU, along in his trade confrontation against China, but he's doing the opposite by making enemies with America's allies. Do you agree?
Well, I do agree that it would be a positive thing if Trump could focus his energies on China, because China is really the country that matters the most economically, and that I think has been the biggest cheater, and they've been, stealing our intellectual property. And I think if you're going to pick a fight with China, which I think it's about time we did, you do want your allies on your side. So I think that some of the auto tariffs and the steel tariffs that have antagonized some of our European and Canadian allies probably were not well timed. And now we've got this developing trade tiff going on with China, and I think Trump is going to want our allies on his side.
Yeah, but they're not on his side. And those retaliating against Trump's tariffs on aluminum and steel are targeting products and regions important politically and economically to Republicans. Although the U.S. economy is doing well, but still, how much domestic pressure can President Trump take?
There's no question that there's a tense time right now for trade, especially between China and the United States. The new tariffs have gone into effect, and China is now threatening new tariffs on us. And Trump even said that we could possibly impose tariffs on everything that comes in from China, all $500 billion a year, and that would be, that would hurt consumers for sure. But I would say this, that there's a feeling among, I think, a majority of Americans that we cannot continue to live with the status quo where China takes advantage of us, where we don't have a level playing field, where we buy $500 billion of their products, but they only buy $150 billion from us, and also the theft of our intellectual property. So there's got to be some major concessions from China, and we'll see if that happens. It would be helpful if we had our allies like Germany and France and the United Kingdom and Canada on our side, because that way it puts more pressure on China. But I do think in the end, Donald Trump wants lower tariffs, not higher tariffs. He wants all the countries to lower their tariffs, hopefully to zero, so we have a true free trade paradise, but we're a long way from that right now.
So in your opinion, for America, in terms of correcting unfair trade practices, it's a, if not now, when kind of moment?
I think that's the point. I think that a lot of Americans believe that, look, the United States economy is very strong right now. We got another blockbuster jobs report this week. I think we're going to get potentially 4.5% growth for the second quarter of 2018. And this is coming at a time when a lot of the European countries' economies have been slowing down and China's economy has been slowing down. I think Trump really believes that, this is the American moment. This is the time for us to flex our muscle and to really stop being taken advantage of. China, the Beijing leaders said that the United States is waging a trade war, one of the biggest trade wars in history. And I think what Donald Trump would say is we've been in a trade war for 10 or 15 years and we're losing against China. And we've got to start retaliating in ways that level this playing field. And I think in the end that's going to happen. But I don't know if it's going to take 2 months or 6 months or a year or 2 years.
Mexican President-elect López Obrador takes office on December 1st. Although both President Trump and the Mexican President-elect have started on a positive note, it remains to be seen whether or not they can work together on immigration, border security, and trade, while also keeping their promises on domestic issues. One thing's for certain, people are looking for a change to the political status quo. Maybe these two can make progress on the major issues that have been plaguing the US and Mexico for years. Stay tuned, we'll bring you perspectives that you won't see elsewhere. To find us, search for Zooming In with Simone Gao. Thanks for watching and see you next week.